The wind had a bite to it that promised an early and unforgiving winter. It swept down from the jagged peaks of the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone across the barren flats. Eli Thatcher felt it on the back of his neck, a familiar warning he had learned not to ignore. He pulled the brim of his worn hat lower, his eyes scanning the collection of ramshackle tents and crude wooden structures huddled together like shivering animals. This was not a town. It was a trading post, a place called Calder's End, and it existed on the very edge of the map and well outside the reach of any meaningful law. Men came here to trade pelts for whiskey, lies for supplies, and to shed the thin veneer of civilization they wore in proper towns. It was a place of hard bargains and harder men, and Eli had no business here other than a dwindling supply of salt and flour. He guided his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, through the muck and mire of the main thoroughfare. The air was thick with the smoke of cheap coal and the stench of unwashed bodies. Men with eyes like hungry coyotes watched him pass, their gazes lingering on the Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard and the Colt revolver holstered low on his hip. Eli ignored them, his face a mask of indifference carved by years of solitude and sorrow. His gaze was steady, his shoulders set. He was not looking for trouble, but he was a man who had long ago stopped walking away from it. He was about to dismount near the largest of the tents, the one that served as a general store and saloon, when he saw her. She was tethered to a thick wooden post near a wagon with a splintered axle, as if she were livestock. A heavy iron chain, rusted and cruel, was clamped around one ankle and snaked up to a manacle on her wrist, forcing her into a hunched, defeated posture. Her dress was a collection of tears and filth, the original color lost to dirt and grime. Her hair, a tangled mat of dark brown, hung over her face, obscuring it from view. She was small, bone-thin, and trembled with a ceaseless, violent shudder that was only partly from the cold. Eli stopped Gideon, his hand tightening on the leather reins. The world around him seemed to fade into a low hum, the coarse laughter of the traders, the clang of a distant blacksmith's hammer, the incessant whine of the wind. It all fell away. All he saw was the girl, a human being tied to a post. Two men were leaning against the broken wagon, passing a bottle between them. They were thick-set and grimy, their faces shadowed by stubble and greed. They spoke in low, brutish tones, but the wind carried their words to him. "Should get a decent price for her down in the mining camps," the first one said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Plenty of men there with coin and no company." "She's a fighter, though," the other grumbled, taking a long pull from the bottle. "Bit her last owner. That's why we got her cheap. Said she was a runaway thief. We'll beat the fight out of her before we sell. A little discipline is all she needs. Make her compliant." A cold, quiet rage began to build in Eli's chest. It was a familiar feeling, an old ghost he carried with him every day. It tasted of ash and regret. He thought of his sister, Clara, of her bright smile and trusting eyes, and how the world had stolen them both. He had been too late then. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. He would not be too late again. He swung down from Gideon's back, his movements fluid and deliberate. The jingle of his spurs was the only sound he made as he approached the two men. They looked up, their eyes narrowing with suspicion as he came to a stop a few feet away. "She's not for sale to you, friend," the first one said, his voice a low growl. He straightened up, trying to use his bulk to intimidate. Eli's gaze did not waver. It was fixed on the man, cold and hard as river stone. "She is not for sale to anyone," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You will unchain her." The two men exchanged a look, then burst into ugly, barking laughter. "And who are you to be giving orders?" the second one sneered. "Her PA? Some long-lost lover?" "I am the man telling you to let her go," Eli said simply. His hand drifted down, his thumb coming to rest on the worn wooden grip of his Colt. It was not a threat. Not yet. It was a statement of fact. The laughter died in their throats. They saw the look in his eyes now, a look that spoke of lines crossed and consequences paid in blood. Still, greed was a powerful motivator. "She's our property," the first man insisted, though his voice had lost its bluster. "We paid good money for her." Eli reached into the leather pouch on his belt. He did not count the coins, a mix of silver dollars and smaller denominations. He just pulled out a handful and threw it on the ground between them. The coins scattered in the dirt, gleaming dully in the gray afternoon light. "That should cover your expenses," he said. "Take it and ride out." The men's eyes darted from the money on the ground to Eli's face, then to the revolver at his hip. They saw no room for negotiation in his expression. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the broken wagon. The girl, who had not moved or made a sound, flinched as a gust whipped a strand of matted hair across her face. The second trader licked his lips, his eyes flicking back to the silver in the mud. "The key is on the wagon seat," he mumbled, his bravado gone. He and his partner scooped up the coins, not bothering to wipe them clean. Without another word, they moved to their horses, mounted up, and spurred them away, disappearing into the bleak landscape without a backward glance. Eli did not watch them go. He walked to the wagon and picked up the heavy, rusted key. He knelt in the dirt in front of the girl. She recoiled, pressing herself against the rough wood of the post, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, his voice softer than before. He moved slowly, deliberately, showing her the key in his hand. Her breathing was ragged, shallow. He could see the bruises on her face now, a dark purple stain blooming on her cheekbone, a cut on her lip. Her eyes, wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have consumed her, were fixed on him. They were the color of a stormy sky. He worked the key into the lock on the ankle shackle first. It was stiff with rust and neglect. It took him a moment of forcing it, his knuckles scraping against the cold iron, before the lock finally gave way with a loud click. He slid the heavy chain off her leg, revealing a raw, chafed wound beneath. Then he stood and unlocked the manacle on her wrist. The moment the iron fell away, she slumped forward, her strength giving out. Eli caught her before she hit the ground, his arm wrapping around her thin shoulders. She was as light as a bundle of sticks and trembled like a leaf in a storm. She smelled of dirt and fear and long suffering. He said nothing else. There were no words for this kind of cruelty, and no questions that needed asking. The answers were written in the raw flesh of her wrists and the hollow terror in her eyes. He lifted her gently into his arms and carried her to his horse. She remained stiff, her body rigid with fear, but she was too weak to fight. He mounted Gideon, settling her in front of him on the saddle. She felt impossibly fragile against his chest. He pulled a thick woolen blanket from his saddle roll and wrapped it around her, trying to shield her from the biting wind. Then, he turned Gideon's head toward the mountains, away from the festering wound of Calder's End, and urged him into a steady walk. The sun began its slow descent, painting the undersides of the clouds in bruised shades of orange and purple. The journey was long and silent. The girl, Serena, though he did not know her name, did not speak a single word. She would not look at him, keeping her face turned away, her gaze fixed on the desolate landscape unfolding before them. Every time Gideon's hoof struck a loose rock or the wind gusted with sudden force, she would flinch, her whole body seizing in a spasm of fear. Eli held her steady, one arm around her waist, a firm but gentle presence. He could feel the sharp angles of her bones through the thin blanket. He wondered how long it had been since she had eaten a proper meal, how long she had been wearing those chains. The anger in his chest cooled into a hard, dense ache. It was the same ache he had carried for 5 years, since the day he had found Clara in that squalid tent in a Nevada mining camp. He had been a boy then, barely a man, full of foolish pride and slow to act. He had heard the rumors, the whispers about the foreman who took a liking to his sister. But he had not understood the danger. He had failed to see the wolves circling. By the time he had ridden to the camp, it was too late. He found her broken, the light in her eyes extinguished by a cruelty he could not comprehend. She had died 2 days later, her hand in his, whispering his name. He had buried her on a hillside overlooking a valley, and a part of himself had been buried there with her. He had been carrying that weight ever since, a silent, solitary penance. Now, with this strange, broken girl in his arms, the weight felt heavier than ever. He was no longer a boy. He would not be too late again. They climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the open plains behind. The trail became a narrow track winding through dense forests of pine and aspen. The air grew thinner, colder. The silence of the high country was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic clop of Gideon's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the trees. Far off in the distance, a coyote called out to the rising moon, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed off the canyon walls. The cry seemed to mirror the desolation in his own heart and the profound loneliness that radiated from the girl in his arms. The wilderness was harsh, unforgiving, a place where the weak perished and only the strong or the lucky survived. It was a world he understood. It was well after dark when they finally arrived, tucked into a narrow valley, sheltered by a towering granite cliff that blocked the worst of the northern winds, was his homestead. It was not much, a small, sturdy cabin built of hand-hewn logs, a lean-to for Gideon, and a small corral. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the star-dusted sky. He had left a fire banked in the hearth, a small comfort to return to. He dismounted carefully, lifting the girl down from the saddle. Her legs buckled, and he had to hold her up to keep her from falling. He led her to the cabin door, pushed it open, and guided her inside. The single room was Spartan but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its embers glowing a dull red. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt was tucked into one corner, and shelves holding tins of food and supplies lined another wall. It was a place of solitude, a fortress against the world and his own memories. He settled her into one of the chairs by the hearth while he stirred the embers, adding fresh logs until a proper fire was blazing, casting flickering shadows across the room. The warmth began to push back the chill. The girl, Serena, did not move. She just stared into the flames, her hands clenched in her lap. Eli moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency. He filled a pot with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the fire to warm. He sliced bread from a loaf and opened a tin of beans, heating them in a small pan on the hearthstones. When the food was ready, he placed a plate and a mug of water on the table in front of her. "Eat," he said. It was not a command, but a quiet encouragement. She stared at the food as if she did not understand what it was. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she picked up a piece of bread and began to eat, her movements stiff and uncertain. She ate like a starving animal, quickly and without stopping, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected the food to be snatched away at any moment. While she ate, Eli fetched a clean cloth and the pot of warm water. He knelt before her again. She flinched, pulling back in the chair, her eyes wide with renewed panic. "Your wrists," he said, his voice low and even. "They need cleaning." He held out his empty hands, waiting. He let her see that he meant no harm. After a long, tense moment, she slowly, reluctantly, extended her hands toward him. He took them gently. Her skin was ice cold. He carefully dabbed at the raw, bloody wounds where the manacles had been, cleaning away the grime. She winced but did not pull away. When he was done, he wrapped clean strips of cotton cloth around her wrists. His touch was sure and impersonal, like that of a doctor. Yet there was an underlying gentleness to it that she could not have known for a very long time. He stood and put the things away. The fire crackled and popped, filling the silence. The food and the warmth seemed to have thawed some of the terror that held her frozen. She finally looked at him. Truly looked at him. Her gaze meeting his across the small room. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, rasping whisper, rough from disuse. "Why?" she asked. Just that one word. Eli looked at her, at the fear and confusion warring in her stormy eyes. He saw the ghosts of 100 horrors in her expression. He thought of all the reasons he could give her. He could tell her about Clara. He could talk about right and wrong. He could try to explain the rage he felt at the sight of men who treated a human being like property. But he knew none of those words would matter. They were his reasons, not hers. She did not need reasons. She needed something far simpler. He walked over to the fire, staring into the dancing flames for a moment before turning back to her. He did not answer her question. Instead, he gave her the only truth that mattered in that moment. "You're safe now," he said. The words hung in the air between them, simple and absolute. It was a promise. Her expression did not change, but a single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. Later, when the fire had burned down to glowing coals, Eli laid a spare blanket on the floor near the hearth for her, but she did not move from the chair, her eyes heavy with an exhaustion that went beyond the body. When she finally did stir, she bypassed the blanket and curled up on the hard wooden floorboards, as close to the fire as she could get, pulling her knees to her chest in a tight, protective ball. Eli watched her for a moment, his heart aching with a sorrow too deep for words. He crossed the room, scooped her up, she weighed next to nothing, and carried her to the bed. He laid her down on the mattress and pulled the quilt over her. She did not resist, her body limp with weariness. She was asleep before he even turned away. He took the spare blanket and settled himself on the floor by the door, his back against the solid wood. He laid his Winchester rifle across his lap, its cold steel a familiar comfort in his hands. He would not sleep. He would keep watch. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song, and the coyotes called to one another in the dark. But inside the small cabin, it was quiet. The only sound was the soft, even breathing of the woman in his bed. He closed his eyes, but all he saw was Clara's face, and he knew this night, like so many others, would be a long one. The first few days in the cabin passed in a feverish haze for Serena. The initial shock of her rescue gave way to a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that kept her tethered to the bed. Sleep was not a refuge, but a landscape of fragmented nightmares that left her waking with a silent scream caught in her throat. During her waking hours, she drifted, a ghost in a strange house, watching the man who had saved her move with a quiet, deliberate grace that was at odds with the raw power in his shoulders and the hardness in his eyes. Her body, long neglected and abused, began the slow, painful work of healing. The wounds on her wrists, where the iron had rubbed her raw, scabbed over, leaving behind angry red lines that would eventually fade into pale, permanent scars. They were a map of her suffering, a story etched into her skin that she could never erase. But it was her ankle that festered. The shackle had cut deep, and the grime of her captivity had worked its way into the wound. It swelled to twice its normal size, the skin stretched taut and hot to the touch, a dark red that spread up her calf. A fever took hold of her, leaving her shivering violently one moment and burning with an internal fire the next. Through it all, Eli was a constant, silent presence. He never crowded her, never spoke more than was necessary. He tended the fire, ensuring the cabin remained a pocket of warmth against the encroaching mountain cold. He fetched cool water from the spring-fed creek that ran behind the cabin, bathing her forehead with a damp cloth. He brewed a bitter tea from willow bark that helped to bring the fever down, holding the mug to her lips and tilting it gently so she could drink. He cleaned and dressed her ankle twice a day. The first time he touched it, she had cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound of pain and fear, and had tried to scramble away from him. He had simply stopped, His hands held up where she could see them, and waited. He did not speak, did not try to soothe her with empty words. He just waited until her ragged breathing slowed. His patience a solid, unmovable thing in the quiet room. Then, moving with an almost imperceptible slowness, he had finished his work, his touch firm but gentle, his focus entirely on the task. She had not pulled away again. He was a man of few words, and she was a woman who had forgotten how to use them. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, thick with unspoken questions and unshared histories. He would sometimes try, his voice a low rumble that seemed to startle him as much as it did her. "Is there anything you need?" he asked one afternoon, standing by the door, his hat in his hands. She shook her head, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on a crack in the floorboards. Another time, as he changed the dressing on her ankle, he asked, so quietly she almost did not hear him, "Does anyone know where you are? Anyone who might be looking for you?" A tremor ran through her. She flinched as if struck, her body curling inward, her face becoming a stony, impenetrable mask. The door to her past slammed shut, bolted from the inside. He saw the shift, the terror that flashed in her eyes before being swallowed by a cold, hard emptiness. He did not ask again. He simply finished wrapping her ankle, his movements economical and precise, and then he left the cabin. Staying outside for a long time, she heard the rhythmic, percussive thud of an axe splitting wood until long after the sun had set. Slowly, as the fever broke and the pain in her ankles subsided to a dull throb, a routine began to form, an unspoken rhythm that governed their days. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. She would lie still, listening to him stir the fire, the soft scrape of the poker on stone, the splash of water as he washed his face. He would go out to tend to his horse and check his trap lines, and when he returned, he would prepare a simple breakfast of oatmeal or fried corn mush. He would set a bowl on the small table for her, and they would eat in silence, separated by a chasm of experience. Two solitary figures in the vast, indifferent wilderness. They rarely made eye contact. Her gaze was always directed downward, at her hands, at the floor, at the fire. His was most often turned outward, toward the window, as if he were constantly scanning the horizon for some unseen threat. It was easier that way. Looking at him for too long made something ache in her chest, a feeling she could not name and did not trust. Looking at her, at the haunted, fragile beauty of her face, stirred the ghosts of his own failures, reminding him of all the things he had been unable to protect. One morning, the sun rose bright and cold, casting a crystalline light on a fresh blanket of snow that had fallen during the night. The world outside the cabin was a pristine expanse of white, the air sharp and clean. Serena, feeling stronger than she had in months, rose from the bed and walked stiffly to the cabin's single window. She saw him in the small clearing beside the woodpile. He had stripped off his shirt, despite the biting cold, and his bare torso gleamed with a fine sheen of sweat in the morning sun. He was splitting firewood, his body a study in controlled power. The muscles in his back and shoulders bunched and coiled as he swung the heavy axe, bringing it down with a sharp, satisfying crack that echoed in the still mountain air. Each movement was efficient, precise, honed by years of hard labor. He was not a large man, but he was built of whipcord and sinew, lean and strong like a wolf. His skin was tanned by the sun, and a tracery of old scars crisscrossed his back, white lines on a canvas of bronze. Serena watched, her breath fogging the small pane of glass. She could not look away. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her, starting deep in her belly and rising to flush her cheeks. It was a feeling so foreign, so dangerous, that it terrified her. For years, the sight of a man's body had meant only one thing: pain and violation and fear. Her own body was a thing to be hidden, a source of shame and misery. But this feeling was different. It was a flicker of something she had thought long dead, a primal, involuntary response that had nothing to do with fear. It was desire, pure and simple, and it was followed immediately by a wave of hot, suffocating shame. Her hand flew to her mouth as if to stifle a cry. What was she thinking? How could she feel such a thing? She was ruined, sullied, a piece of damaged goods that this man had, for some inexplicable reason, taken pity on. He had saved her, fed her, tended her wounds. He had shown her a quiet, unassuming kindness that she had done nothing to deserve. And, in return, she was looking at him with this hunger. The shame was so intense it made her dizzy. She stumbled back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs, and retreated to the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin like a shield. That night, the tension in the cabin was thicker than ever. She could feel his eyes on her as they ate their silent meal of rabbit stew, though she did not dare to look up and confirm it. When it was time for sleep, she could not bring herself to lie in the bed. It felt like a betrayal, a luxury she did not deserve. After he had settled by the door, his rifle in its usual place across his lap, she slipped from beneath the quilt and curled up on the hard floor near the fire, pulling the thin spare blanket around her shoulders. The floorboards were cold and unyielding. It felt right. It felt like what she deserved. She must have drifted off, because the next thing she knew, strong arms were lifting her. She gasped, her body going rigid with panic, a scream rising in her throat. "It is all right," Eli's voice said, a low murmur in the darkness. "You are safe." He carried her as if she weighed nothing. The scent of pine smoke and cold night air clung to him. He did not take her to the bed. Instead, he carried her back to the floor. But this time, he laid down the thick bearskin rug he used for his own bedding and settled her on top of it. He took the heavy quilt from the bed and draped it over her, tucking it in around her shoulders. Then, without another word, he stood up, pulled on his heavy coat, and walked out of the cabin, closing the door softly behind him. Serena lay there, wrapped in warmth, her heart still pounding. She stared at the closed door, utterly bewildered. He had not been angry. He had not questioned her. He had simply understood her need to retreat. And instead of forcing her back to a comfort she could not accept, he had made her chosen place more comfortable. Then he had removed himself entirely, giving her the entire space, giving her solitude and safety. He had gone out into the freezing night for her. She did not sleep for the rest of the night. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of the wilderness, and thought of the man outside in the cold. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, the cabin door opened. Eli entered, a fine dusting of snow on his shoulders. His face was drawn and tired, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her, lying on the floor, and a silent understanding passed between them. He built up the fire and put a pot of coffee on to boil. As the rich aroma filled the small room, Serena sat up, pulling the quilt around her. He poured 2 cups and handed one to her. She took it, her fingers wrapping around the warm tin. She had to know. "Where did you go?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I was nearby," he said simply, sipping his coffee. "Just keeping watch." She looked at him, at his steady, unwavering gaze, and something inside her, a wall she had been building for years, brick by painful brick, finally crumbled. The words came out in a torrent, a choked, broken confession. "My mother died," she began, her voice barely audible. "She had a fever. After she was gone, my stepfather, he said I was just another mouth to feed. He had debts. He sold me to a man who ran a freighting company for $50. She paused, taking a ragged breath. Eli did not move, did not speak. He just listened, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of her memory. "I tried to run away," She continued, the words tearing at her throat. "The first time, they caught me. They punished me. The second time, I got further. I thought I was free, but they sent men after me. The men you saw at the trading post. They were taking me to the mining camps. They said no one would care what happened to me there." She finished, her story laid bare in the quiet morning light. It was a brutal, ugly tale, stripped of all detail, but the horror was in the spaces between the words. She waited for his reaction. Pity, disgust, revulsion. She had seen all of those in the eyes of others. Eli set his coffee cup down on the hearth. He said nothing. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, he reached out and gently, tentatively, took her hand. His fingers were calloused and rough from work, but his touch was incredibly soft. He simply held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, a simple, profound gesture of connection. It was not a touch of pity or of desire. It was a touch of acceptance. It was the first act of human kindness she had known in years, and it undid her completely. A sob escaped her, and then another, and soon she was weeping. The silent, racking sobs of a soul that had forgotten how. He did not let go of her hand. He just sat with her, a silent witness to her grief, until the storm passed. Far below the mountain sanctuary, in the muddy streets of a town called Harmony, the story of the girl from Calder's End had arrived, but the tale, passed from the mouths of drunken traders to gossiping merchants, had twisted and changed with each telling. It was no longer a story of a rescue, but of a transaction. A quiet, grim-faced mountain man had bought a chained woman. In the saloon, men speculated over cheap whiskey. "She must be a thief," one declared. "Why else would she be in chains?" "More likely a whore," another slurred, wiping foam from his mustache. "Probably ran out on her pimp. That Thatcher fellow must have a particular taste for wild ones." The women of the town whispered behind their hands in the general store. They spoke of a fallen woman, a creature of sin and vice, who had lured a reclusive man into her web. They imagined her as a temptress, a Jezebel, a danger to the decent folk of their community. The truth of her suffering was lost, buried under a landslide of prejudice and cruel assumption. The story eventually reached the ears of a man for whom rumors were a stock in trade. His name was Silas Kane, and he was a bounty hunter. He was a tall, gaunt man with a face like a bird of prey and eyes that missed nothing. He made his living tracking down men and women with prices on their heads, and he was very good at his job. He heard the tale of the chained girl and the mountain man, and his professional interest was piqued. A runaway in chains often meant a reward. He rode to Calder's End and spent a few silver coins buying drinks for the lowlifes who frequented the trading post. It did not take him long to find a man who had been there the day Eli had taken Serena. "Thatcher, you say?" Kane asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Lives up in the high country?" "That is him," the man confirmed. "Keeps to himself. Never knew him to have a woman before. Paid cash for this one. He did. Never even tried to haggle." Kane nodded slowly, filing the information away. He had no warrant, no poster with a name or a face, but his instincts, honed by years of hunting human prey, told him there was money to be made. A girl in chains, a reclusive buyer, a story that stank of desperation. Somewhere in that combination, there was a profit. He finished his drink, thanked the man, and walked out into the cold gray afternoon. He saddled his horse, a lean, mean-looking black gelding, and turned its head toward the mountains. The tracks were a few days old, but the ground was soft. It would not be hard for a man like him to follow. The bond that had formed between them was a fragile thing, woven from silence and shared solitude. Serena was growing stronger each day. The haunted, animalistic terror in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a watchful stillness. She moved about the cabin with increasing confidence, her limp lessening, the angry red on her ankle fading to a dull purple. She had started helping with small tasks, fetching water from the creek, stirring the stew, folding the blankets in the morning. She did these things without being asked, her movements small and quiet, as if she were trying to make herself indispensable, to earn her place in this sanctuary he had provided. Eli watched her, his expression unreadable, but a deep, unfamiliar ache was taking root in his chest. It was a feeling perilously close to hope, and it scared him more than any blizzard or grizzly bear. He had built his life on a foundation of loss, and he did not know how to stand on any other kind of ground. But their supplies were running low. The flour sack was nearly empty. The coffee tin held only a few beans, and they were out of salt. The trip to Harmony was unavoidable. He dreaded it. He dreaded leaving her alone, even for a day. The world was full of men like the ones at Calder's End, and he had brought her into his world, making her his responsibility. He also dreaded the town itself, the prying eyes, the wagging tongues, the suffocating judgment of people who knew nothing of his life but felt entitled to an opinion on it. The morning he was to leave, he rose earlier than usual. He checked the action on his Winchester, filled a pouch with extra cartridges for his Colt, and saddled Gideon. When he came back inside, Serena was awake, sitting up on the bearskin rug where she now slept by the fire, her dark hair a wild tangle around her shoulders. She watched him, her eyes wide and anxious. "I have to go to town," he said, his voice gruff. "For supplies. I will be back by nightfall." She just nodded, her hands twisting in the fabric of the quilt. He hesitated at the door. "Keep the door barred. Do not open it for anyone. Do not go outside."
"I will not,"
she whispered. He looked at her for a long moment, 100 unspoken things passing between them. Then he turned and left, the cold morning air hitting him like a physical blow. The ride down the mountain was a descent from peace into turmoil. Up here, the only laws were those of nature, clear and honest in their brutality. Down there, the laws were made by men, and they were twisted, petty things, full of spite and hypocrisy. The town of Harmony was nestled in a wide, muddy valley, a haphazard collection of unpainted wooden buildings lining a single main street. As Eli rode in, a hush seemed to fall over the place. A group of men talking on the boardwalk of the saloon stopped mid-sentence, their heads turning to follow his progress. A woman shaking a rug out of a second-story window paused, her eyes narrowing. He was a familiar stranger to them, the mountain man who came to town a few times a year for supplies and then vanished back into the wilderness. But today, the stares were different. They were sharper, more intense, laced with a prurient curiosity. The rumors had arrived before him. He ignored them, his face set like granite. He tied Gideon to the hitching post outside the mercantile, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was halfway across the muddy street when a man stepped out from the covered boardwalk to block his path. It was Jedediah Stone, a man whose only notable qualities were a paunch belly and an insatiable appetite for other people's business. "Thatcher," Stone said, his voice carrying in the quiet street. "Heard some interesting talk about you." Eli stopped, his gaze cold and flat. He did not speak. Stone, emboldened by the audience gathering on the boardwalk, took another step forward. "Heard you took a wild woman off some traders up at Calder's End. Chained up. They said, that true?" Eli's silence was more menacing than any threat. He simply looked at Stone, his eyes like chips of ice, and the man's smug expression began to falter. The other men on the boardwalk shifted uncomfortably. Eli did not acknowledge the question. He sidestepped Stone as if he were a piece of refuse in the street and continued toward the general store, the heavy tread of his boots echoing in the sudden silence. He pushed open the door to the mercantile, a bell jingling overhead. The place smelled of sawdust, leather, and dried apples. The proprietor, a balding, weasel-faced man named Miller, was behind the counter. He offered Eli a greasy, ingratiating smile. "Mr. Thatcher, good to see you. Been a while," Miller said, rubbing his hands together. "What can I get for you today?" Eli gave him the short list: flour, salt, coffee, beans, cartridges for his rifle. Miller began to measure out the goods, his movements slow and deliberate. The silence stretched. Eli could feel the eyes of the other customers in the store on his back. "Things are quiet up in the mountains, I imagine," Miller said, his voice casual, but his eyes were sharp and probing. "A man can get lonely up there all by himself." Eli did not rise to the bait. He just stood, waiting. Miller finished bagging the flour and tied it off with a piece of twine. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, though it was loud enough for everyone in the small store to hear. "Heard you found yourself some company, though a real bargain, from what Jedediah was saying. Tell me, Thatcher, what is the going rate for a used whore these days?" Something inside Eli snapped. The cold, quiet rage he kept perpetually banked within him erupted into a white-hot flash of violence. He did not shout, did not utter a word. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in its efficiency. He reached across the counter, grabbed a fistful of Miller's shirt, and hauled him over the top. Before the smaller man could even cry out, Eli's other fist connected with his jaw. It was a single, brutal punch, delivered with all the force of his body. The impact sent Miller staggering backward. He crashed through the large plate glass window at the front of the store with a sound of splintering wood and shattering glass. He landed in a heap on the boardwalk outside, amidst the glittering shards, moaning and spitting blood. The store was in chaos. A woman screamed. The other men backed away, their eyes wide with shock and fear. Eli stood for a moment, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and bleeding. He looked down at the mess, then back at the terrified faces staring at him. He left the supplies on the counter, turned without a word, and walked out of the store, stepping over the groaning form of Mr. Miller. He untied Gideon, swung into the saddle, and rode out of Harmony, leaving a wake of stunned silence and the lingering scent of violence behind him. Back at the cabin, the silence felt different to Serena. It was not the companionable silence she shared with Eli. It was an empty, echoing void. The cabin, which had become her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the window pane, sent a jolt of fear through her. She kept the door barred, as he had instructed, and stayed away from the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. But as the hours passed and nothing happened, her fear began to subside, replaced by a restless curiosity. She had been living in this man's home, but she knew nothing about him, other than the quiet strength of his hands and the deep sadness in his eyes. Cautiously, she began to explore the small room. She ran her fingers over the rough-hewn wood of the table he had built, touched the worn leather cover of the handful of books on a small shelf. One was a Bible, its pages thin and soft from use. Another was a book of poems. On the small mantelpiece above the fireplace, there was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was the only object in the cabin that was not purely functional. It was a thing of beauty, made with care. Hesitantly, she reached out and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a piece of faded blue velvet, was a single photograph, a daguerreotype in a small brass frame. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly. It was a portrait of a young girl, perhaps 15 or 16 years old. She had a heart-shaped face, a spray of freckles across her nose, and a tangle of dark hair that fell over her shoulders. But it was her eyes that made Serena's breath catch in her throat. They were Eli's eyes, the same shape, the same startling shade of gray-blue, but where his were guarded and full of shadows, the girl's were bright with life and laughter. She was smiling, a wide, open-mouthed grin of pure, uncomplicated joy. Serena sank to the floor, clutching the photograph to her chest. A wave of understanding, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over her. This was his sister. This was the girl he carried in the silence, the ghost that haunted the corners of his soul. and looking at her bright, innocent face. Serena finally understood. He had not saved her out of pity. He had saved her because he had looked at her, chained and broken, and he had seen this girl. He was trying to save Serena in a way he had not been able to save his sister. The thought did not make her feel like a substitute. It made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. She felt a profound, aching connection to the smiling girl in the photograph, and to the grieving brother who had given her a safe place to heal. She waited for him as the sun began to set, casting long, deep blue shadows across the snow. She kept the fire blazing, a beacon of warmth in the encroaching darkness. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would show him the photograph and tell him that she understood. But when the cabin door finally creaked open, all her practiced words vanished. Eli stumbled inside, leaning heavily against the doorframe. His hat was gone. His clothes were torn and smeared with mud. A nasty cut on his cheek was still weeping blood, and his right hand was swollen and bruised. The knuckles split open. He looked not just exhausted, but defeated, as if he had been wrestling with the entire world and had barely managed to draw. Serena gasped, rushing to his side. "What happened? Are you hurt?" He raised a hand to stop her, his eyes dark with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. "Do not ask," he said, his voice a low, ragged rasp. "Just stay inside." He pushed the door shut and slid the heavy wooden bar into place. He moved like an old man. His shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. He went to the water bucket, washed the blood from his face and hands with jerky, painful movements, and then sat down heavily in the chair by the fire, staring into the flames, his entire body radiating a cold, bleak despair. Serena's heart twisted in her chest. All the ugliness of the world he had tried to shield her from. He had gone out and faced it for her, and it had wounded him. She did not know what to do, what to say. Words were useless against this kind of pain. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackle and hiss of the fire. The space between them was charged with unspoken things. Finally, she knew what she had to do. It was a terrifying gamble, a leap of faith into an unknown abyss. But he had shown her his wounds. Now, she had to show him hers. She stood up and moved to the center of the room, into the flickering pool of firelight. She turned her back to him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Then, with trembling fingers, she began to unbutton her dress. The worn fabric slid from her shoulders and pooled at her feet, leaving her standing in only a thin, tattered chemise. She could feel his gaze on her, a physical weight on her skin. Her body was a landscape of scars, old and new, a testament to the cruelty she had endured. A long, thin scar ran down her left shoulder blade. The faint, crisscrossing lines of a lash were visible on her lower back. Her skin, which had not seen the sun in years, was pale, almost translucent in the firelight. She stood there, exposed, vulnerable, her entire body trembling with a mixture of fear and a strange, defiant pride. This was who she was. This was what had been done to her. A single, hot tear slid down her cheek, followed by another. A choked sob escaped her, the sound of a heart breaking open. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her weeping and the crackle of the fire. She thought, for one terrible second, that she had made a mistake, that he would turn away in revulsion. Then, she heard him move. He crossed the room in 2 long, silent strides. She flinched, expecting a touch that never came. Instead, she felt the soft, heavy weight of a wool blanket settling around her shoulders. He wrapped it around her, cocooning her in its warmth, his hands careful not to touch her skin. He stood behind her, his presence a solid wall of warmth and safety. He leaned in close, his breath stirring her hair. He spoke her name, his voice a low, rough whisper, and the sound of it, the simple, profound act of naming her, shattered the last of her defenses. Serena! They stood like that for a long time. Later, he guided her to the bearskin rug by the fire, and they lay down, side by side, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from each other's bodies. They lay awake for hours, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling, two wounded souls adrift in a vast, silent wilderness. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours before dawn, his hand moved, and his fingers brushed against hers. It was a feather-light touch, tentative, questioning. She did not pull away. Instead, she shifted her hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Nothing else was said, but in that simple, silent gesture, everything changed. A fragile bridge had been built across the chasm of their pain, miles away, in the frozen twilight of the mountains. A lone rider paused on a ridge, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain below. Silas Kane dismounted, kneeling in the snow. He ran a gloved finger over the tracks. A single horse, moving fast, heading up toward the high passes. He had followed the trail from Harmony, a trail marked by haste and a few drops of blood that had fallen from a rider's injured hand. He stood up, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. He was close. He could feel it. He pulled his collar up against the biting wind, mounted his horse, and continued his slow, patient pursuit, a shadow moving through the snow, closing in on the small, fragile light of the cabin in the distance. The quiet that had settled in the small cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with a low, humming tension, a delicate and constant awareness of each other's presence. They had found a rhythm, a way of living in the small space that was like a slow, intricate dance. They slept on their separate bedrolls by the fire, the few feet of space between them a chasm of unspoken history and a fragile bridge of shared loneliness. They never touched, not since that first night when their fingers had intertwined in the darkness. But the memory of that brief contact lingered in the air, a promise and a warning. Serena's healing was no longer just physical. It was a deeper mending of the spirit. The hollow, haunted look in her eyes had begun to recede, replaced by a cautious light. She had taken over the cooking, a silent claiming of her role in their shared life. She proved to be resourceful, turning the simple ingredients Eli provided, flour, dried beans, the occasional rabbit he brought back from his trap lines, into savory stews and warm, crusty bread. The act of kneading dough, of stirring a pot over the fire, seemed to ground her, to connect her to a sense of normalcy she had long been denied. The cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. She swept the floors, mended the small tears in his shirts with thread pulled from a worn-out blanket, and sometimes, when she thought he was not looking, she would hum a quiet, half-forgotten tune. The sounds of life were returning to her. One clear, cold afternoon, Eli led Gideon out of the lean-to, a second, older saddle slung over his shoulder. He did not say anything, but Serena understood. She followed him out into the snow-covered clearing, her heart thumping with a mixture of excitement and fear. He helped her mount the sturdy buckskin, his hands firm and impersonal on her waist as he lifted her up. He taught her to ride with the same quiet patience he did everything else. He did not overwhelm her with instructions. Instead, he walked alongside the horse, his hand on the bridle, his low voice a steady murmur. "Feel the horse move under you," he said. "Become a part of its rhythm." He showed her how to hold the reins, how to shift her weight to guide the animal, how to speak to it not with words, but with pressure and release. After an hour of walking in slow circles, he finally let go of the bridle. "You are ready," he said, stepping back. Serena's knuckles were white where she gripped the reins. She looked down at him, her eyes wide. She took a breath, then gently nudged Gideon's sides with her heels. Just as he had shown her, the horse moved forward into a slow, rocking walk. She was in control. She was moving under her own power, free and untethered. A feeling of pure, exhilarating liberation washed over her. She turned to look at Eli, a wide, unbidden smile spreading across her face. It was a small, hesitant thing, like a winter flower pushing through the snow, but it transformed her, chasing away the shadows for a fleeting moment. Eli saw it, and for a second, he stopped breathing. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and the sight of it was a punch to the gut, a stunning, painful kind of beauty. He had to look away, his own heart a confused, aching tangle in his chest. That evening, the memory of her smile hung between them, making the silence in the cabin feel charged and heavy. As he cleaned his rifle by the fire, Serena quietly retrieved the small wooden box from the mantelpiece. She took out the photograph of his sister and sat on the floor across from him, holding it in her hands.
This was your sister,
she said, her voice soft. It was not a question. Eli's hand stilled. He looked up, his face a mask. He nodded once, his jaw tight.
She looks happy,
Serena whispered, tracing the edge of the brass frame with her finger. The simple observation seemed to undo him. The mask crumbled, and the raw, unhealed grief he kept so carefully hidden was laid bare in his eyes. He set the rifle aside and stared into the fire, his gaze distant, lost in a past that was more real to him than the present moment. Her name was Clara, he said, his voice rough with disuse, as if he had not spoken the name aloud in years. She was 17. She loved to dance. She believed people were good, at their core. She did not have a cautious bone in her body. He fell silent, the firelight casting deep, flickering shadows on his face. Serena waited, her heart aching for him, for the boy he must have been and the smiling girl in the picture. There was a mining camp a few miles from our homestead, he continued, his voice a low, pained rasp. Full of rough men. I told her to stay away, but she saw no harm in anyone. They held a dance one Saturday night. She went. I was supposed to go with her, to watch out for her, but I was a boy, arrogant. I got into an argument with our father and I refused to go. I thought she would be safe. He paused, swallowing hard. They took her, 3 of them, Foreman and his cronies. They took her from the dance. No one stopped them. They said she went willingly. I did not find out until the next morning. By then, he trailed off, his fist clenching on his knee. By the time I found her, it was too late. I was too slow. I should have been there. I should have protected her. He finally looked at Serena, his eyes full of a self-loathing so profound it was like a physical wound. I buried her on the hill behind our old house. Then I left. I've been running from that day ever since. Serena looked from his tortured face to the bright, laughing face in the photograph. The pieces of him finally fell into place. His solitude, his silence, his explosive rage in the face of cruelty, his unwavering protection of her.
You carry her with you,
she said gently, her voice full of a wisdom born of her own suffering. I see her in your eyes when you look at me, when you found me. You saw her. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. It was not your fault, Eli, she said, her voice firm but soft. You were a boy. You cannot carry the weight of other men's evil. She took a deep, shuddering breath. You did not fail her, but you are trying to save me like you could not save her. Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. She had seen right through him, to the very core of his grief, to the motivation that had driven him since the moment he first saw her chained to that post. He felt stripped bare, his defenses torn away by her gentle, unerring insight. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a specter from his past or a responsibility he had to bear, but as Serena, a woman who had endured the unimaginable and had emerged not broken, but forged into something strong and resilient and beautiful. An overwhelming wave of emotion washed over him, grief, regret, and a powerful, terrifying tenderness. He moved before he could think, closing the distance between them in an instant. He knelt before her and took the hand that was not holding the photograph. He raised it to his lips and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to the back of her hand, just over the faint, silvery scars on her knuckles. The brief, warm pressure of his mouth against her skin was a brand, a silent confession of everything he could not say. It was an apology, a plea, and a promise, all in one. Then, as quickly as he had moved, he released her and stood up, stepping back as if burned. The air in the cabin crackled with the force of their shared emotion. He turned away, unable to look at her, and stared out the small window into the vast, dark wilderness, his knuckles white where he braced his hand against the log wall. The next morning, a fragile peace had settled. The storm of the night before had passed, leaving a quiet, shimmering clarity in its wake. Eli announced he was going to check his trap lines further up the mountain, a journey that would take him most of the day. There was a new, unspoken understanding between them. He trusted her to be safe. She trusted him to come back. After he had gone, Serena felt a sense of calm she had not known was possible. The cabin was a haven, the surrounding wilderness a protective wall. She spent the morning baking bread, the familiar, comforting rhythm of the work soothing her. The warm, yeasty scent filled the small room, a smell of home, of life. She was taking the loaves from the hearth when she heard it, the crunch of snow outside, the soft nicker of a horse that was not Gideon. Her blood ran cold. She froze, her hand still holding a loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth. She listened, her ears straining. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps on the small wooden porch, followed by a sharp, commanding knock on the door. She did not move, did not breathe. Eli's words echoed in her mind. "Do not open it for anyone." "I know you are in there," a voice called from the other side of the door, a dry, rasping sound that scraped at her nerves. "The smoke from the chimney is a dead giveaway. Open the door." Silence. "I can wait all day," the voice continued, laced with a chilling patience. "Or I can kick the door in. Your choice." Serena's heart hammered against her ribs. She backed away from the door, her eyes wide with terror. This was it. The world had found her. The brief, beautiful peace was over. A moment later, the door shuddered violently as a heavy boot crashed against it. The wooden bar groaned in protest. Another kick, and the bar splintered, the door flying open with a crash. A man stood framed in the doorway, a tall, gaunt silhouette against the bright white snow. He wore a long, dark coat, and his face was all sharp angles and shadows, his eyes like those of a hawk, missing nothing. It was Silas Kane. He stepped inside, bringing the cold with him. His gaze swept the room, taking in the warm fire, the fresh bread, the bearskin rug on the floor. It was a picture of domestic tranquility, and his presence was a violent violation of it. His eyes finally settled on her, and a thin, cruel smile touched his lips. "Well now," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Look what we have here. The man is gone, I see. Left his little bird all alone in the nest." He took another step into the room, and Serena saw the revolver holstered at his hip, the handle worn smooth from use. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am the man who has come to collect you," he said simply. He uncoiled a length of rope from his belt. "There is a man, a stepfather, I believe, who is very eager to have you returned. Seems he feels you owe him for your upbringing. He has offered a handsome reward for your return." Serena's blood turned to ice. Her stepfather, the source of all her misery, the thought of being returned to him, of being punished for her escape, was a fate worse than death. "Now, you can come with me easy," Kane said, advancing on her slowly. "Or you can make this difficult. I get paid either way, but it will be a whole lot more pleasant for you if you do not fight." He lunged for her. Serena reacted on pure instinct, throwing the hot loaf of bread at his face. He grunted in surprise, batting it away, and the brief distraction gave her a precious second. She darted around the table, putting it between them, but the cabin was small, and there was nowhere to run. He cornered her near the fireplace. his hands shooting out and grabbing her by the arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a steel trap. He dragged her toward the door, her feet scrambling for purchase on the smooth wooden floor. He was immensely strong, his grip unbreakable. He pushed her out onto the porch and into the biting cold, forcing her toward his black horse, which stood waiting patiently. He drew his revolver, the click of the hammer being pulled back unnaturally loud in the mountain silence. He pressed the cold barrel of the gun against her temple. "Not another move," he snarled. Serena stopped struggling. A strange, cold calm washed over her. She had lived with fear for so long. It felt like an old, familiar coat. She knew this ending. She had been expecting it her whole life. A scream felt like a waste of breath. There was no one to hear it but the silent trees and the indifferent sky. Fighting was pointless. This was simply the turning of a page in a book that had only ever been filled with sorrow. She closed her eyes, waiting. Hours later, Eli rode into the clearing. A brace of rabbits slung over his saddle. A feeling of deep contentment had settled over him during the ride home. A feeling so unfamiliar it was almost unsettling. He thought of Serena's smile, of the way her hand had felt in his. He was whistling a low, tuneless melody as Gideon came to a stop. Then he saw it. The cabin door, hanging open, splintered at the frame. The blood drained from his face. He was off his horse in an instant, his rifle in his hand before his feet even hit the ground. The rabbits fell unnoticed into the snow. He ran to the cabin, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. The inside was in disarray. The table was overturned. A loaf of bread lay crushed on the floor, and the room was filled with a cold, dead air. She was gone. He burst back outside, his eyes scanning the snow, his mind racing, piecing together the story written in the tracks. Gideon's prints, the prints of a second horse, a shod horse, not a wild one, the deep tracks of heavy boots, the smaller, scuffed prints of Serena's shoes, the signs of a struggle. The trail led away from the cabin, heading down the mountain. He stood for a moment, a terrible, guttural sound of rage and despair tearing from his throat. He had failed again. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, and the world had kicked in the door and taken the only thing that mattered inside it. But the despair was quickly consumed by a cold, clarifying fury. The grief and guilt that had paralyzed him for 5 years were burned away, leaving behind a single, hard, sharp point of purpose. He did not hesitate. He did not pack supplies. He swung back into Gideon's saddle, his Winchester held ready in his hands. He spurred the horse into a gallop, following the tracks down the mountain path. Into the deepening twilight, he rode through the night, a relentless, vengeful shadow against the snow, his face a mask of stone. The fury in his chest was afire, keeping the cold at bay. But beneath the fury, a single terrified thought beat in time with his horse's hooves. Too late, too late, too late! It was a prayer and a curse, and it drove him onward into the darkness. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky, offering no comfort and little light. Eli rode with a singular, all-consuming focus, his body and the horse moving as one. The world had narrowed to the tracks in the snow, a trail of violence leading away from his home. The cold was a living thing, a predator that gnawed at his exposed skin. But he did not feel it. The fire in his chest, a furnace of pure, undiluted rage, burned too hot. Beneath the rage was the cold, hard stone of fear, a terror so profound he could not allow himself to acknowledge it. To feel that fear would be to falter, and he could not afford to falter. The rhythm of Gideon's hooves was a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the night, pounding out a single, desperate word. Again, again, again. He would not fail again. He tracked them through the night and into the gray, frozen hours of dawn. The trail led downward, away from the high country, winding through treacherous passes and over frozen creeks. The man he was following was skilled, but he was in his own territory. Eli knew every rock and every tree, every game trail that offered a shortcut, every ridge that offered a vantage point. As the first weak rays of sun spilled over the eastern peaks, he saw them. They were on a narrow, wind-swept bluff that jutted out over a deep, precipitous canyon 1,000 feet below. A river lay frozen solid, a jagged white scar on the valley floor. The bounty hunter, Cain, had made a small, smokeless fire and was crouched beside it, drinking from a tin cup. His black horse stood nearby, its breath pluming in the frigid air, and Serena was tied to a stunted, wind-blasted pine at the edge of the cliff, her hands bound tightly behind her back. She looked small and broken, her head bowed, her dark hair whipping across her face in the relentless wind. Eli dismounted, his movements as silent as a hunting cat. He tethered Gideon in a thicket of aspen, pulling his Winchester from its scabbard. He moved through the trees, using the terrain for cover, the snow muffling his footsteps. He was within 50 yards when a twig snapped under his boot. It was a small sound, but in the vast, cold silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. Cain was on his feet in an instant, his revolver in his hand, his body tensed. "Show yourself," he snarled, his hawk-like eyes scanning the trees. Eli stepped out from behind a large granite boulder, the Winchester held loosely in his hands, its muzzle pointed at the ground. He did not raise it, not yet. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with an intensity that made the bounty hunter take an involuntary step back. When Serena saw him, a small, choked gasp escaped her lips. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and a desperate, burgeoning hope, were locked on his. Cain's composure returned quickly, replaced by a smug, predatory grin. "Thatcher," he said, his voice a low drawl, "I had a feeling you would be along. A man does not pay for goods and then let them get stolen without a fuss." Eli did not respond. He just kept walking forward, slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving Cain's. "You have put me to a great deal of trouble," Cain continued, waving the barrel of his revolver in Serena's direction. "But the reward for this one will make it all worthwhile. Her stepfather will pay a premium for her return. Seems she has a disobedient streak that needs to be permanently corrected." Eli stopped about 20 feet away, the wind whipping at his coat. "Let her go," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Cain laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that the wind snatched away. "Now, why would I do that? I have a legal claim, a contract, you might say. You, on the other hand, you are in a difficult position, harboring a runaway, assaulting a respectable shopkeeper. The law will not look kindly on you. Thatcher, you could hang for what you did in Harmony." He paused, letting his words sink in. He holstered his revolver, a gesture of arrogant confidence. "But I am a reasonable man, a businessman. I am willing to offer you a deal. You walk away right now, and I will forget I ever saw you. I will even cut you in for a share of the reward, 10%. For your trouble, a way to clear your name and make a little profit at the same time. All you have to do is turn around and ride away." Eli looked past Cain, his gaze meeting Serena's. He saw the terror in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw something else, a silent plea, a desperate faith in him that he had done nothing to earn but that he would die to honor. He saw Clara's ghost in the periphery, her face pale and accusing. He had run from that ghost for 5 years. He would not run anymore. He lowered the muzzle of his Winchester until its stock rested on the snowy ground. He looked back at Cain, and his voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but carried the weight of an oath. "You are not taking her." The bounty hunter's smile vanished. "Fool," he hissed, and his hand dropped to his revolver. But Eli had been waiting for the movement. He was not a gunman who relied on speed, but on anticipation and brute force. as Cain's hand closed around the grip of his pistol. Eli lunged forward, closing the distance between them in 3 long, powerful strides. He did not reach for his own gun. He swung the heavy Winchester like a club. The steel barrel caught Cain on the side of the head with a sickening thud. The bounty hunter staggered, a look of stunned surprise on his face, his unfired pistol falling from his numb fingers into the snow. Eli did not give him a chance to recover. He drove his shoulder into Cain's chest, tackling him to the ground. The 2 men rolled in the snow, a tangle of limbs and fury. Cain was bigger, heavier, but Eli was fueled by a righteous rage that gave him the strength of 2 men. He landed a solid punch to Cain's jaw, then another. Cain roared, a sound of pure animal fury, and heaved Eli off him. He scrambled to his feet, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from a sheath on his belt. Eli was still rising from the ground when Cain lunged, the blade flashing in the pale morning light. Eli twisted away, but not fast enough. The tip of the knife sliced across his ribs, a line of fire that seared through his coat and shirt, and he felt the hot, wet slick of his own blood. He grunted in pain, stumbling back. Cain pressed his advantage, slashing wildly with the knife. Eli was forced to give ground, his movements hampered by the wound in his side. He parried a thrust with the barrel of his rifle, the clang of steel on the steel echoing in the cold air. They were dangerously close to the edge of the cliff, the wind howling up from the canyon below, trying to pull them into the abyss. Meanwhile, Serena was fighting her own battle. The sounds of the struggle, the grunts of pain, the sharp, ugly clang of steel, had shocked her out of her terrified paralysis. She would not be a passive victim. Not again. She strained against the ropes that bound her wrists, her skin raw and bleeding. But the knots were too tight. Frantically, she twisted her body, rubbing the rough rope against the sharp, splintered bark of the pine tree. It was slow, agonizing work. A strand frayed, then another. Eli staggered as Cain's boot caught him in his wounded side. A wave of blackness washed over him, and he fell to one knee. Cain stood over him, his face contorted in a triumphant sneer, the bloody knife raised for a final, fatal thrust. At that moment, Serena's bonds gave way. Her hands were free. She did not hesitate. Her eyes darted around, searching for a weapon. Her gaze fell on a thick, dead branch lying near the base of the tree, its end jagged and sharp where it had broken off. She snatched it up, its rough wood a solid, real thing in her trembling hands. She launched herself at Cain's back, a silent, desperate fury. She drove the pointed end of the branch into the space just below his ribs with all the strength she possessed. Cain screamed, a high, strangled sound of agony and surprise. He dropped his knife, his hands flying to the wound in his side where the jagged wood was embedded. He turned, his eyes wide with disbelief, and looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. He took a clumsy, stumbling step toward her. Then his eyes rolled back in his head. He teetered on the edge of the cliff for a long, terrible moment, a dark scarecrow against the pale sky. Then he fell backward into the empty air, disappearing into the vast, silent canyon below. Silence descended on the bluff, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind. The world seemed to hold its breath. Serena stood, shaking violently, the branch still clutched in her hand. Then she saw Eli, crumpled on the ground, his hand pressed to his side, his shirt stained a dark, spreading crimson. "Eli!" she cried, her voice cracking. She rushed to his side, falling to her knees in the snow. She gently touched his face, her fingers trembling. "Oh, God, Eli, please!" He opened his eyes, his gaze clouded with pain but focused on her. He reached up, his hand covering hers, his touch surprisingly strong. He saw the terror on her face, the tears streaming down her cheeks, and knew that her fear was no longer for herself, but for him. He managed a weak, pained smile. "You are safe now," he whispered, his voice a ragged breath. "Even if I am not." Tears streamed down her face as she cradled his head in her lap.
Do not say that,
she sobbed, her tears falling onto his pale, dirt-streaked face.
You cannot die. You cannot leave me.
The journey back to the cabin was a slow, agonizing ordeal. Eli, weak from blood loss, leaned heavily on her, his arms slung over her shoulders as she helped him onto Gideon's back. She mounted behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, holding him steady in the saddle, feeling the tremors of pain that racked his body with every step the horse took. When they finally stumbled back into the sanctuary of the cabin, he collapsed onto the bed, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. Serena worked with a frantic, focused energy. She stoked the fire until it was roaring, heating a pot of water. She tore strips from her cleanest petticoat for bandages. With a small, sharp knife, she cut away his blood-soaked shirt. The wound was a long, ugly gash along his left side. Deep and angry, it was still weeping blood. She cleaned it as gently as she could with warm water and a clean cloth, her hands steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. He bore the pain with a stoic silence, his jaw clenched, his eyes closed. The wound would need stitches. She found his sewing kit, a small leather pouch with needles and thick, waxed thread. She sterilized a needle in the flame of a candle, her hands shaking slightly.
I have to stitch it, Eli,
she said, her voice barely a whisper.
It is the only way.
He opened his eyes and looked at her.
I know,
he said, his voice strained. He took a folded piece of leather from the table beside the bed. Give me this, to bite on. Her hands trembled as she pushed the needle through his skin for the first time. He grunted, his body tensing. But he did not cry out. She worked quickly, her stitches small and even, her focus absolute. It was a crude, clumsy surgery, but she was closing the wound, stopping the bleeding, saving his life. When she was finished, she covered the stitched gash with a pad of clean cloth and tightly bound his ribs. She spent the next 2 days nursing him, her world shrinking to the confines of the small cabin. She kept the fire lit, brewed him broth and bitter herbal teas, and changed his dressings. He drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, sometimes murmuring a name in his delirium. Clara. Each time he said it, a fresh wave of sorrow and understanding washed over Serena. On the 3rd day, his fever broke. He woke to find her asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head resting on her arms. He watched her for a long time, the pale morning light tracing the soft curve of her cheek. She had saved him. This fragile, wounded woman, who he had thought to protect, had found a strength he never knew she possessed and had saved his life. Serena, he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open. She sat up, instantly alert. Eli, are you all right? Do you need anything? Water, he said, his throat dry. She brought him a cup, holding it to his lips as he drank. We need to get you to a doctor, she said, her brow furrowed with worry.
The town, Harmony.
No, he said, his voice firm, though weakened by his ordeal. No doctor, no town. But your wound, it could get infected. He reached out, his hand closing over her wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes were clear and intense. Listen to me. Serena, the law in that town will not believe you. They will see a dead bounty hunter and a woman with a past. They will listen to the lies your stepfather told. They will call you a whore and a murderer. They will hang you. I will not let that happen. We stay here. She looked at him, at the fierce, unwavering protection in his eyes, and knew he was right. He was still protecting her, even at the risk of his own life. The thought filled her with a love so fierce and so painful it stole her breath. That night, a profound stillness settled over the cabin. A gentle snow had begun to fall outside, blanketing the world in a soft, forgiving white. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow on the log walls. Eli was sitting up in the bed, propped against the pillows, and Serena was sitting on the edge. changing his bandage one last time before sleep. When she finished, her hand lingered on his arm. The air between them grew thick, charged with all the things they had never said, all the feelings they had never dared to acknowledge. He turned his hand over, his fingers lacing with hers. He looked at her, his gaze full of a raw, tender vulnerability that mirrored her own. There were no words. None were needed. She leaned forward, and he met her halfway, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was achingly gentle. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming, of two lost souls finding shelter in one another. Tears streamed down her face, tears of grief for what they had lost, and tears of gratitude for what they had found. Slowly, tenderly, they came together on the narrow bed. It was a joining of wounds, of scars, of shared pain and fragile hope. Every touch was a question, and every response a quiet reassurance. It was raw and real, a sacred, desperate act of love in a world that had shown them only cruelty. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the heavy quilt, her head resting on his chest, his good arm holding her close. She listened to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart, a rhythm that was becoming as familiar to her as her own.
I was never touched before,
she whispered into the darkness, her voice thick with tears.
Without fear?
He held her tighter, his lips pressing against her hair. Outside, the snow fell silently, muffling the world, creating a small, perfect pocket of warmth and stillness. Inside, there was only the sound of their breathing, the soft hiss of the fire, and the gentle, trembling touch of their hands in the dark. The world began to thaw, slowly at first, then with a triumphant rush. The iron grip of winter loosened its hold on the mountains, and life, stubborn and resilient, returned. The snow receded from the clearing, leaving behind the rich, dark scent of damp earth. The creek behind the cabin, once muted and sluggish under a sheet of ice, now chattered and sang over the rocks. Tiny, vibrant green shoots pushed their way through the blanket of dead leaves, and in the sun-drenched patches of the forest floor, the first shy wildflowers, purple columbine and pale, delicate spring beauties, began to bloom. The spring that blossomed in the wilderness was mirrored in the small, quiet world within the cabin. The raw, desperate edges of their love had softened into a deep, abiding tenderness. Eli's wound healed, leaving a puckered, angry scar along his ribs that Serena would trace with gentle fingers when they lay together in the quiet of the night. It was a mark of his sacrifice for her, and she loved him for it. His nightmares of Clara began to fade, replaced by a quiet, peaceful sleep he had not known in years. Serena, too, was transforming. The color had returned to her cheeks, and the gaunt, hunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a serene, watchful calm. Laughter came to her more easily now, a soft, musical sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did Eli. They fell into a comfortable, domestic rhythm, a life built of small, shared moments. They would fish for trout in the newly thawed creek, their shoulders brushing as they sat on the bank. He taught her how to read the signs of the forest, the tracks of deer and the calls of birds. She taught him the words to a lullaby her mother used to sing. Their life was a small, perfect island of peace in a vast, indifferent world. But peace, in that hard country, was a fragile and fleeting thing. They were sitting on the porch one late afternoon, watching the sun dip behind the western peaks, when they heard it, the unmistakable sound of multiple horses, moving at a steady pace up the mountain trail. It was not the sound of a lone rider. It was the sound of purpose, of authority. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his body tensed, his hand instinctively dropping to the colt at his hip. He pulled Serena behind him, his body a shield between her and the approaching sound. A few minutes later, 4 riders emerged from the tree line. They were townsmen, their faces grim and determined. The man in the lead, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a silver star pinned to his vest, was Sheriff McCabe. Eli's face hardened into a mask of cold stone. He did not move, did not speak, as the riders came to a stop in the clearing. "Thatcher," the sheriff said, his voice a low, no-nonsense rumble. He did not dismount. His gaze flickered from Eli to the woman partially hidden behind him. "We need to have a talk." "I have got nothing to say to you, McCabe," Eli said, his voice flat and cold. "This is not a social call," the sheriff replied, his eyes narrowing. "There have been reports. A man named Miller in Harmony with a broken jaw and a shattered window, and a bounty hunter, Silas Kane, who rode into these mountains looking for a runaway girl and has not been seen since. His horse wandered back to town 3 weeks ago. Saddlebags empty. Folks are saying you had something to do with both." His gaze settled fully on Serena. "And they are saying it was over her." The air grew thick with a dangerous tension. The other men shifted in their saddles, their hands resting near their own pistols. "Go inside, Serena," Eli said, his voice a low command, his eyes never leaving the sheriff. "Bar the door." But Serena did not move. She stepped out from behind him, her small frame straight and unbowed, her gaze clear and direct. She looked at the sheriff, at the hard, accusing faces of the men with him, and she felt not fear, but a calm, resolute strength. She had hidden for too long. She would not hide anymore.
"No, Eli,"
she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an unshakable firmness. She placed a hand on his arm. "We face this together." Eli looked down at her, at the fierce, unwavering loyalty in her eyes, and a wave of pride and love so intense it almost buckled his knees washed over him. He gave a single, sharp nod. He looked back at the sheriff. "Whatever business you have, you can say it to both of us." Sheriff McCabe studied them for a long, silent moment. He was a man who had seen every kind of trouble the frontier had to offer, and he saw something in their faces, a fierce, united defiance, that gave him pause. "My business," he said finally, "is in town. There is to be an inquiry. You will both ride back with us, now." The journey to Harmony was a silent, grim procession. Eli and Serena rode side by side, their heads held high, the sheriff and his men flanking them like a guard of honor for the condemned. When they reached the town, it seemed as if every resident had turned out to watch them pass. Faces peered from windows, and small, silent groups gathered on the boardwalks, their eyes full of a mixture of morbid curiosity, fear, and condemnation. They were led to the sheriff's small, cramped office, which also served as the town's jail. The room was quickly filled with the town's most prominent citizens, the mayor, the blacksmith, the preacher, and Mr. Miller, his jaw now set in a crooked line, a look of smug vindictiveness on his weasel-like face. It was not a trial, not officially, but it felt like one. Sheriff McCabe sat behind his large, battered desk, his face an impassive mask. "All right," he said, his voice filling the stuffy room. "I want to know what happened. From the beginning." All eyes turned to Serena. She stood before the desk, Eli a solid, silent presence at her side. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the hostile, judgmental faces before her. She thought of the chained, terrified girl she had been, and of the woman she had become. She would not let them break her. "My name is Serena," she began, her voice clear and steady. "And I was not a runaway. I was sold. After my mother died, my stepfather sold me to a man to pay a gambling debt. I was his property, to be used and discarded as he saw fit." A murmur went through the crowd. Mr. Miller scoffed audibly. Serena's gaze hardened. "I was chained like an animal because I tried to escape the life he had planned for me. The men at Calder's End, the ones Mr. Thatcher took me from, they were taking me to the mining camps to be sold again. Eli, Mr. Thatcher, he saved me. He asked for nothing in return. He gave me shelter and he gave me safety." She paused, her eyes finding Eli's for a brief, reassuring moment. "The man you call a bounty hunter," she continued, her voice dropping. "His name was Cain. He found us. He told me my stepfather had placed a reward on my head. He tried to take me by force. He was going to drag me back to a life that was worse than death." Her voice trembled slightly, but she did not let it break. "We fought him. Eli was wounded. I did what I had to do to survive, to protect the only person in this world who has ever protected me. Cain is dead because he tried to take my life, and I refused to let him." She finished, her story hanging in the thick, silent air of the room. She had spoken her truth, a raw, ugly truth that the townspeople did not want to hear. Sheriff McCabe leaned back in his chair, his expression unmoved. He had heard 1,000 stories, 1,000 justifications. "A convenient tale," he said, his voice laced with cynicism. "A dead man cannot contradict you. All I have is your word against that of your legal guardian, your stepfather. The law is clear on the matter of property and runaways." A cold despair began to creep into Serena's heart. She had spoken the truth, and it had not been enough. Then Eli spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a shard of ice, silencing every whisper, commanding every ounce of attention. "The law?" he said, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the townsmen, a look of quiet, burning contempt in his eyes. "You want to talk about the law? You stand here and you judge this woman. But which one of you has ever spent a night in chains? Which one of you has ever been sold like a mule? You talk of property, but you do not talk of justice." He took a step forward, his gaze locking onto the preacher. "You speak of morality, preacher, but what is moral about a world that allows a girl to be bought and sold? A world where men can profit from the misery of others and call it business?" He turned his gaze on Miller. "You call her a whore, a name that falls so easily from your lips, because it is easier than looking at the truth. It is easier than admitting that this world, your world, is built on the suffering of people you do not have the courage to see." His voice dropped, becoming low and intensely personal. "I knew a girl once," he said, and the room grew so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "My sister, she was full of life and trust. And this world, the world you men have built, it chewed her up and spat her out. I see her in every girl who is lost, every woman who is ignored, every soul that is judged by whispers and lies instead of being helped with compassion. You are not judging Serena here today. You are judging yourselves, and you are all found wanting." A profound, shamed silence fell over the room. The men shifted on their feet, their gazes dropping to the floor, unable to meet the raw, accusatory power in his eyes. It was in that moment of silence that another voice spoke, a woman's voice, clear and strong. "He is right." A woman had pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She was a widow named Martha, her face lined with the grief of her own hard life. She had known the Thatcher family years ago, before tragedy had scattered them. "I knew Clara Thatcher," she said, her gaze fixed on the sheriff. "She was a good girl, a sweet girl. And this town, this world, it failed her. We all failed her. I will not stand by and watch it happen again." She turned and looked at Serena, her expression full of a fierce, maternal compassion. "I believe this woman. I believe her because I have seen the truth of Eli Thatcher's heart, and he would not defend a lie." Martha's words were the stone that started the avalanche. Another person murmured their agreement, then another. The tide of public opinion, so fickle and so powerful, began to turn. The hard, judgmental faces in the crowd softened with a dawning sense of shame and empathy. Sheriff McCabe looked at Eli, at Serena, and then at the faces of the people in his town. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man who knew which way the wind was blowing. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and rubbed his hand over his face. "There is no body," he said, his voice flat. There is no evidence of a crime, other than a lot of rumors and a missing bounty hunter who few will mourn. As far as I am concerned, this matter is closed. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Eli. But I am warning you, Thatcher, this town will not forget. There will always be whispers. Be careful who you trust. He stood up, a clear dismissal. Now get out of my office, all of you. They walked out into the late afternoon sun, the crowd parting before them. The stares that followed them now were different, filled with a grudging respect, with pity, with a new, unsettling understanding. They mounted their horses and rode out of Harmony, leaving the town and its judgment behind them. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, but it was a comfortable, peaceful silence. They had faced the world together, and they had won. Not a clean victory, but a victory nonetheless. The next day, Eli took a spade and began to dig in the rich, dark earth of the clearing, in a patch of ground that caught the morning sun. He worked all day, turning the soil, removing the rocks, building a low stone wall around a small, rectangular plot. He was building her a garden. When he was finished, Serena came out of the cabin with a small cloth bag. It contained a handful of seeds she had found in an old tin in the back of a cupboard, marigolds and cornflowers. She knelt in the soft, freshly turned earth and, one by one, she planted them. She was putting down roots. She was choosing to grow. That evening, they sat together on the small porch he had built, her hand resting in his. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth. They watched the sunset, a spectacular explosion of orange and pink and purple behind the dark, silent mountains. The world was vast and wild and often cruel, but here, in this small, sheltered space, they had found a measure of peace. They had found a home. A comfortable silence settled between them as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky. "Why?" Serena asked softly, her voice barely a whisper against the sounds of the coming night. "All this time, you never asked me about my past. Not really. Why did not you ever ask?" Eli turned his head, his gaze meeting hers in the twilight. His eyes were full of a deep, unwavering love. A small, gentle smile touched his lips. "Did not need to," he responded, his voice a low, comforting rumble. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Just needed you to know. You are safe now." Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.